"You're safe now." The words were stones dropped into a frozen well, swallowed by a wind that howled like a wounded beast. Snow did not fall, it flew sideways, a horizontal blizzard that scoured the plains and erased the line between earth and sky. He had found them huddled in the lee of a skeletal aspen grove, for figures barely distinguishable from the mounding drifts. A woman, her face a mask of wind-burned frost and frozen tears, held a threadbare blanket around 3 children. They were not small children, but their bodies, though large, were shuddering with a cold so deep it seemed to have reached their very souls. They were statues of despair, cast out into the teeth of the world's indifference. Their clothes were thin, meant for a life indoors, and the cruelty of their abandonment was a physical presence, colder than the ice clinging to their hair. The man, Silas, knelt. His hands, covered in thick leather gloves, were steady as he unlashed the oilskin bundle from his saddle. He didn't ask what had happened. The story was written in their chapped lips, their hollow eyes, and the way the mother, Ilara, flinched when he moved, as if expecting a blow. He simply worked. He wrapped the smallest girl in a heavy wool blanket, his movements economical and sure. He saw how their bodies were soft and swollen, signs of a life that was both indulged and neglected, a paradox of cruelty he couldn't yet fathom but recognized as a brand of profound brokenness. He lifted her, her weight a strange mix of substance and frailty, and set her on his horse. One by one, he did the same for the other 2, their eyes wide with a terror so profound it had frozen past screaming. Finally, he turned to the woman. He held out the last blanket. "My cabin is close," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She stared at his offered hand, her gaze unfocused, lost in the storm of her own private horror. He did not rush her. He simply waited, a bulwark against the gale, until her trembling fingers finally reached for his. The cabin was not a home, it was a fortress against the wilderness. Hewn from thick pine logs chinked tight with mud and moss, it was a single room, dominated by a great stone hearth on one end and a sturdy, handmade cot on the other. It smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and solitude. Silas carried the girls in first, laying them on a bed of furs he pulled from a chest. They did not stir, having fallen into the deep, exhausted sleep of those who have surrendered. Ilara followed him inside, stumbling over the threshold, her body swaying as the sudden, shocking warmth of the room washed over her. The door boomed shut, and the shriek of the wind was instantly muted to a low, mournful moan. The silence inside was thick, broken only by the crackle and hiss of the fire Silas immediately began to build. He moved with a practiced grace, laying kindling and logs with the precision of a watchmaker. Flames caught, grew, and began to throw dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. He did not speak. He filled a heavy iron pot with snow from a barrel by the door, hung it over the fire, and began slicing dried jerky and root vegetables into the melting water. The actions were his language. Each gesture said, "You are provided for. There is warmth here. There is food here." Ilara sank onto a low stool near the hearth, her hands held out towards the growing blaze, her fingers white and numb. She watched him, this silent, weathered man, his face a landscape of sun-creased leather, his eyes the color of a winter sky. Fear was still a cold knot in her belly, but for the first time in days, it was not the only thing she felt. The firelight painted his silhouette against the wall, a solid, unmoving shape of protection in a world that had tried to tear her and her daughters apart. The scent of stew began to fill the small space, a smell so ordinary, so domestic, it felt like a miracle. Days bled into one another, measured not by the sun, which remained hidden behind a shroud of unceasing grey, but by the rhythm of the cabin. The storm raged outside, locking them in their small sanctuary. Silas would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to disturb them. He would tend the fire, check the snares near the cabin, and ensure their small world remained secure. Ilara and her daughters slept, a profound, healing sleep that lasted for nearly 3 days. When they finally woke, it was to the smell of broth and the sight of Silas sitting at his small table, meticulously cleaning a rifle, its oiled steel gleaming in the firelight. He simply nodded when he saw their eyes open, then ladled the steaming broth into wooden bowls. The first meal was a silent affair. The girls, whose names he learned were Rose, Lily, and Iris ate with a desperation that spoke of long starvation, their soft hands shaking as they held the spoons. Their bodies, which had seemed burdens in the snow, now seemed only fragile. They were children who had been fed but never nourished. Ilara ate slowly, each spoonful a conscious act of reclaiming life. After they ate, she took the bowls, found a bucket and a cloth, and washed them. It was a small act, but in the quiet of the cabin, it was a declaration. It was the first stitch in the mending of a life. A quiet routine formed. Silas provided the wood, the food, the unbreachable security of the walls around them. Ilara provided the care within. She mended their tattered clothes with thread she found in Silas's meager supply chest. She brushed her daughter's hair. She spoke to them in soft, murmuring tones, coaxing them back from the edge. The girls remained mostly silent, their trauma a heavy blanket they had not yet learned how to cast off. But life was returning to their eyes, and a fragile trust began to bloom in the shared silence, nurtured by the steady, unwavering heat of the hearth. One evening, as Silas was carving a piece of birchwood, the rasp of his knife a soothing, rhythmic sound, the youngest girl, Iris, crept to his side. She watched his calloused hands, how they moved with such purpose, turning a block of wood into the rough shape of a bird. For an hour, she stood there, silent and still. Then, in a voice hoarse from disuse, she whispered a single word. "For me?" Silas stopped carving. He looked at the child, her round face illuminated by the fire, her eyes wide and serious. He didn't smile, but the lines around his eyes softened. He nodded once. He worked for another hour, adding detail to the wings, smoothing the head. When he was finished, he rubbed it with oil until the wood grain shone, and handed it to her. She took the small wooden bird and held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. She ran her thumb over its smooth surface, then clutched it to her chest and returned to the fur pile where her sisters lay watching. It was a key turning in a long rusted lock. The next day, Rose spoke, asking if she could help her mother knead the dense bread they made from Silas's flour stores. Soon after, Lily, the oldest, began to hum a tuneless melody as she watched the snow swirl outside the single, small window. The cabin, once a bastion of silence, began to fill with the small, tentative sounds of life returning. Ilara watched this blossoming, and her own healing deepened. The gaunt, haunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a fierce, protective glint. She watched Silas, no longer with fear, but with a quiet, profound gratitude that was deeper than any words she could have spoken. He, in turn, accepted her presence, and that of her daughters, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if his solitary existence had merely been a long winter waiting for this unlikely spring. The past arrived, as it always does, in the dead of night. Ilara woke with a scream caught in her throat, her body rigid with a terror that the warm, safe cabin could not entirely banish. Silas was awake instantly, a shadow detaching itself from the darker shadows by the hearth. He did not move towards her, did not crowd her, but simply stood as a silent witness. The girls whimpered in their sleep, disturbed by their mother's distress. When Ilara's breathing finally steadied, she began to speak, her voice a low, broken whisper into the firelit darkness. She spoke of her husband, Corbin. A man of property and pride, who saw his family not as people to be loved but as reflections of his own status. She spoke of his coldness, his contempt. She described how, after a series of failed business ventures soured his spirit, his contempt curdled into a unique and terrible form of cruelty. He began to resent his daughters, their soft bodies an offense to his rigid sense of order. He called them gluttons, monuments to his failure. Then he began to use food as a weapon. He would force them to eat past fullness, a ritual of humiliation, then rage at them for the very size he had inflicted upon them. He was a man who needed something to break, and he had chosen them. The final act came when a potential business partner was due to visit. Corbin, in a fit of shame and rage, declared he would not have his brood of heifers seen. He had loaded them into a wagon, driven them 2 days into the wilderness, and left them with a single, threadbare blanket. "You are a blight," he had told them, his voice devoid of all emotion. "An embarrassment. Now you will be erased." As she finished, the silence in the cabin was heavy with the weight of her story. Silas finally moved. He walked to the fire, added another log, and the flames roared up, chasing the deepest shadows from the corners. He looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. He was wrong, Silas said, the two words a vow. This is your home. You will not be erased. The world outside the cabin began to thaw. The relentless snow softened to rain, and then, one day, to a weak but determined sunlight that glittered on the melting drifts. With the break in the weather came a visitor. A wiry, buckskin-clad man named Jedediah, a trapper who used Silas's cabin as a rare stop on his long, solitary circuits. He brought news from the towns to the east, and his face was grim as he shared it over a cup of chicory coffee. "There's a man asking about a woman and 3 girls," Jedediah said, his eyes flicking towards Elara and her daughters, who sat quietly by the fire. "A man named Corbin. Rich, by the sound of it. He's not telling folks he abandoned them. He's saying they were taken. Stolen from him by vagrants. He's offering a reward." Silas's hands, which were sharpening a skinning knife, went still. The air grew thick with tension. "He's not offering a reward for their safe return," Jedediah continued, lowering his voice. "He's paying for information on their whereabouts. He wants them back, Silas. Says they're his property. And he's heading this way." Elara's face went pale. The fragile peace of the last few weeks shattered like thin ice. The monster from her past was not gone, he was hunting them. She looked at her daughters, at their faces just beginning to lose the haunted look, at the way Lily was tracing the wings of the wooden bird Iris now kept with her always. A new strength, forged in the safety of this cabin, rose in her. She would not let him take them back to that life. She would not let him break them again. After Jedediah left, promising to return by way of the sheriff's office in the next settlement, a journey of at least 4 days, a new purpose settled over the cabin. The sanctuary had to become a fortress once more. The days that followed were taught with a dreadful anticipation. The slow, quiet rhythm of healing was replaced by the urgent drumbeat of preparation. There was no panic, only a grim, shared resolve. Silas worked on the cabin's exterior, reinforcing the door with an iron bar he forged in the fire's embers and strengthening the shutters on the single window. His hammer blows echoed across the thawing valley, a sound of defiance against the encroaching threat. Inside, Elara organized their supplies with fierce efficiency. She was no longer a victim waiting for a blow to fall. She was a guardian preparing for battle. She taught her daughters to be quiet, to be ready. They helped her, their small hands stacking firewood and rolling bandages from old cloth, their faces serious. They understood, in the way that children do, that the safety of their small world was under threat. A quiet transformation was taking place. The cabin was no longer just Silas's shelter. It was their shared home, and they were all its keepers. One afternoon, as Silas was checking the perimeter, Elara came to stand beside him. She held his rifle, which he had been teaching her to load and fire. Her hands were steady now, no longer trembling. "He will not take them," she said. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as the mountains that ringed their valley. Silas looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and saw not the broken woman he had found in the snow, but an equal. He gave a single, sharp nod. "No," he said. "He will not." They stood together, watching the path that led down from the high pass, 2 silent sentinels guarding the frontier of their new life. The air was still, holding its breath before the breaking of the final storm. He came at dusk, a rider silhouetted against the bruised purple and orange of the dying sun. Corbin was a large man who carried his size with an arrogant authority. He was not alone. 2 hard-faced men, clearly hired for their capacity for violence, flanked him. They stopped their horses 100 yards from the cabin, their presence an immediate violation of the valley's peace. Corbin dismounted, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the wildness of the landscape. He strode toward the cabin as if he owned it. "Elara," he boomed, his voice oozing a possessive rage. "I know you're in there. This foolishness is over. Come out." The cabin remained silent. The door remained shut. Silas stood just inside, his own rifle in his hands, his body poised. Ilara was behind him, the girls huddled in the farthest corner, away from the door. "I am a patient man," Corbin lied, his voice growing tighter. "But my patience has its limits. You are my wife. Those children are my blood. You will not embarrass me further by hiding in this sty with some backward savage." He took another step, and then another, until he was at the door. He raised a fist to pound on it. Before his knuckles could connect, the door swung open. Silas stood there, filling the frame. He said nothing. His silence was more intimidating than any threat. Corbin, momentarily taken aback, sneered. "So, you're the one. The thief. Step aside. I've come for my property." Silas did not move. He simply looked at Corbin, his eyes cold and flat. "There is no property here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Only people. And you are not welcome." The two hired men behind Corbin shifted, their hands moving towards the pistols at their belts. Corbin's face twisted into a mask of fury. "You will regret this," he snarled, and signaled to his men. The quiet valley was about to erupt in violence. The confrontation was brutal and swift. As Corbin's men drew their weapons, Silas moved with a speed that belied his stoic nature. He shoved the heavy cabin door into Corbin, sending the larger man staggering back, and fired his rifle. The shot was not aimed to kill, but to intimidate. The bullet splintered the porch post inches from one man's head, and the explosive crack echoed off the mountainsides. Before they could recover, Silas was on them, using his rifle as a club, a whirlwind of focused, defensive violence. But it was not his fight alone. As the two hired men scrambled to engage Silas, Corbin recovered his balance, his face contorted with hate, and charged for the open doorway. He saw Ilara standing there, her face pale but resolute. "You," he roared, reaching for her. And then, something broke in Ilara. The years of fear, of humiliation, of silent suffering, coalesced into a single, powerful moment of defiance. "No," she whispered, the word a gust of wind. Then, louder, a cry that came from the depths of her soul, "No more." She raised the rifle Silas had given her. She did not fire it. She held it like a shield, a barrier he would not cross. Her stance, her voice, the unyielding fire in her eyes, it stopped him cold. He had come for a victim, a possession to be reclaimed. He was faced with a woman who had found her power. At that precise moment of stalemate, another sound split the air, the thunder of approaching horses. Over the rise came Jedediah, and behind him, a town sheriff and a posse of 3 deputies, their badges glinting in the last of the light. Jedediah had made good on his promise. Corbin's face fell. His rage dissolved into the panicked realization of a man caught in his own lie. The law had arrived. The cruel proprietor, who ruled his own home with absolute tyranny, was powerless against the world outside it. He was no longer the one in control. The aftermath was quiet. The sheriff, a man with weary but discerning eyes, listened to Ilara's story, her voice clear and steady. He looked at the girls, at the simple, fierce love in their mother's eyes, and at the silent, protective presence of Silas. He looked at Corbin, now blustering and indignant, and saw the truth of things. Corbin and his men were taken into custody, not for attempted kidnapping, but for the abandonment that had nearly cost a woman and 3 children their lives, a crime the frontier did not take lightly. As they were led away, the valley seemed to exhale. The threat was gone, not just driven off, but truly vanquished by truth and community. In the days that followed, a new rhythm began. Spring arrived in earnest, washing the landscape in green. Silas, with Ilara and the girls at his side, began to build. They added a room to the cabin. They cleared a patch of land for a garden, the girls' laughter mixing with the sound of shovels striking earth. The wooden bird Silas had carved was joined by others, a small, growing flock on the mantelpiece. The sanctuary had become a home. The silence that once defined Silas's life was now filled with the warmth of a family he had not known he was waiting for. The quiet bond between him and Ilara deepened into a love that needed few words, a partnership built on shared survival and mutual respect. Their hands, once symbols of solitude and suffering, now work together, planting seeds for a future they would build side by side. This story is a reminder that the deepest wounds can be healed by the simplest acts of kindness. It shows that true strength isn't about control or ownership, but about the resilience to survive and the courage to protect. The family Silas and Ilara built wasn't defined by blood or by law, but by a choice to see value in one another, to offer sanctuary, and to build a home where a cruel world had left only desolation. It's a testament to the fact that even after the most brutal winter, a new life can, and will, take root. If this story of survival and the quiet power of compassion moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Stories like these are why we do what we do. Don't forget to tap the bell to be notified of our next cinematic tale, and subscribe to our channel for more content that explores the depths of the human heart. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. Thank you for watching.